It's always important to broaden your horizons and undertake new challenges to keep life fresh while you, in turn, make yourself a better person. Kind of like blind speedrunning a Super Mario 64 level. You play the game so many times that now you could blindly speedrun it, something that was previously thought of as impossible. Squanch Studios recently undertook their own new horizons and decided to make a traditional flat screen game, kind of veering off from the VR path they had before that was working for them. This was originally supposed to be a High on Life video, but after doing some research, I found that the studio that brought us High on Life was originally a VR studio and they solely did VR games. And I kind of fell into the rabbit hole of the VR scene in 2023 and I found some very interesting news. 2023 is going to be a big year for VR. Welcome to the Bread Show, and today we're going to be deep diving into the 2023 scene for VR. There's a lot of new games and even new consoles coming out for VR, and VR could take a big step in 2023. The one thing about that though is that every year since VR's came out, it's low-key been a big year for VR. Almost every gaming studio has tried to dip their little toes into VR. Even Nintendo, it came out with a Nintendo Labo, if you remember that. It was just an attachment for the Nintendo Switch that you hooked on, and it was like goggles. And you could buy it sold separately for $80, and that was brought VR to Nintendo. I don't think it's doing too well. It's probably stopped entirely. 2022 was the year that the metaverse failed. I mean, this was a huge project by Facebook, and now I think it had something around 30 active users in 1 month. It was pretty sad. But that the VR scene is still alive and still going. There's still VR chat, VR Among Us. VR has been coming around pretty slowly, kind of compared to the Wii. And I think one of those reasons why VR has come out pretty slowly is because there's no unifying force to streamline everybody into one thing. PlayStation has a VR set, PlayStation VR 2 that's coming out in February of next year. They had one that came out in 2016. HTC has the premium $1,500 Pro 2 headset. MetaQuest 2 kind of made a more affordable option at $400 for 128 gigabytes. And 128 gigabytes, not gonna lie, is a lot for a VR game, considering that most of the games are 3 to 4 gigabytes. So if the small and average games are 3 to 4 gigabytes, then that means the larger games are around 10. So you can store a lot of games with the 128 gigabyte option. Even though VR has kind of flown below the mainstream radar in terms of video games, the global market is extremely profitable. $7.8 billion in 2020, and they were projecting that, of course, to go way higher. And in 2021, that was, I think it was valued at like $9 billion. So it's a pretty big franchise. The trajectory of VR is kind of reminding me like what happened to the Wii. When the Wii first came out, the first numbers were kind of low. They weren't what you expected from something that kind of had its own 10-year reign on Nintendo properties. The Wii started out slow, but once real games started to come out like Sonic and Mario at the Olympic Games and Wii Sports Resorts and all those things, the Wii kind of took off. But like I said, there's no unifying force for VR. The MetaQuest 2 was kind of trying to be a unifying force by being the most affordable price point for a VR headset. The MetaQuest 2 is doing okay, but it's just the metaverse that's not doing okay with like the 30 active users or whatever. But there are some big games coming out in 2023. First is going to be Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2. That was previously regarded as probably the best VR game of all time, considering, you know, it's only been around for like 6 years, but still it's considered as one of the best VR titles to ever come out. So for it to come out with Chapter 2 in the familiar Walking Dead story that we've known so well, I think that's a really big title for VR. There's another game called Pirates VR. That game could be good, and I think that's one of those games you're going to see floating around Instagram and TikTok with a bunch of crazy clips of people interacting. Speaking of people interactions, there's a co-op first-person shooter game called Lo-Fi that's coming out, and I think that one's going to be a hot one too. It's also coming out in 2023. And lastly, there's a new game coming out called Propagation Paradise Hotel, which has been pretty hyped up. And I think all of these titles, maybe they don't mean anything to you. Maybe the only one that means something to you is the Pirates and Walking Dead, because those are two familiar things that you know. And you never know, these titles could be a big impact in what is modern day gaming. And no, you may not fully move into the VR space. But what could happen is you start incorporating VR into regular gaming. If you have a PlayStation, maybe you get the PlayStation VR, and that opens up a whole new horizon of games. Maybe Nintendo comes back with the Labo 2 or something, and they try to make the attachment for the Switch even better. The two games that I'm really excited for is a lo-fi first-person shooter because of the co-op, and Pirates VR because I know you're gonna get some memorable moments out of that game. And now, if you aren't as familiar in the VR scene, there's a lot of games that you do know that have moved to VR and found a lot of success. Games like Skyrim, Super Hot, Resident Evil 4 and 7, Hitman 3, all of these games have already been out on VR and found success. And people who have the VR console, they download and play these games regularly. Games like No Man's Sky and Hitman 3, top tier titles that have come to VR. Resident Evil 4, one of the greatest games of all time, has been on VR. Super Hot, a game that I used to play online on miniclip.com, is now in VR, and it's better that way because that game was cool with the mouse and keypad, but in VR it's even more Matrix-like, so you can dodge bullets and all that other stuff. And if you still aren't familiar with the things that VR does, there are games that have come out that are original IPs for the VR system, kind of like Blade and Sorcery, Half-Life Alyx, Beat Saber, Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Part 1, and Squanch Studios title Trover that came out in 2019. Now, another reason why VR is going to be a big thing in 2023 is because there's going to be a lot of new VR consoles, a lot of new VR systems coming from some of the top game studios out there. PlayStation is coming out with their VR system in I think February 23, and it's going to be at $550. The PlayStation 1 VR headset came out in 2016, and I think it was around the same price point. The MetaQuest 2 was one of the first VR systems to kind of make it affordable for the general public. It was originally price pointed at $400. Sometimes you can see it for like $300 or $350. The original one was around, I think the Pro was around $1,000 plus. So that one wasn't as accessible, and in the early days you were attached to a wire and that wasn't as convenient. But the MetaQuest 2 is fully remote, so just like the PlayStation one is fully remote, and you're not going to be attached to a wire dancing around a room tying yourself up. Even HTC with the Vive Pro 2, it comes out in I think June 3rd of 2023, and that's going to be priced at $800. So that's two VR systems at two totally different prices, $800 and $550 from PlayStation and HTC, that are going to come out in 2023. Along with the other games that I mentioned before, I think 2023 is going to be a big year for VR. And if you're going to see it in the mainstream, 2023 is going to be the year where you're going to see it in the mainstream. Now, there are some cons to VR and why it wouldn't be a big thing in 2023. Some cons, and of course, the sickness, the nausea, the motion sickness, all those things are there. The safety issues, you know, you've seen the occasional video of somebody running into a wall, diving into a TV, falling out of their chair. So yeah, safety concerns. And then the biggest ones from the gaming perspective is that there's no and there is no definite VR headset to get. All of the VR headsets, if you got the PlayStation VR headset, is most likely because you have a PlayStation. If you're just trying into it, if you're just getting into it, then you're just probably going to go with the MetaQuest 2. If you're trying to get into it, but at a higher level from people who've been in there since the beginning, then you probably go with the HTC. But there's no unifying force. And then lastly, it's just not as powerful as console. You're kind of taking a 10-year, back drop when it comes to graphics and like response times and things like that. So yeah, those are some of the cons of VR and why it wouldn't be a big thing in 2023, but I don't think that's things that's going to cripple the franchise too much. Now back to Squanch, they made some VR titles of their own. Their first game was, I believe, Accounting, that came out in 2016. That was a good one. But my favorite VR title that they had, the second one, was Trover, that came out in 2019. That was the first Rick and Morty title, Rick and Morty style type of title, where Justin Roiland was heavily into the game, and I think he might have directed some of it, wrote wrote some of the jokes, and then I think also voice acted in it. Maybe, I don't know. I'm going to fact check that before I put it in the video. But yeah, Squanch Studios made some really good VR titles. So for them to come out with a traditional flat screen game like High on Life and for it to go this well and have less bugs than premium studios and Game Freak, I think they did a damn good job. So yeah, tell me what you think about the VR scene and how it's going to be affected and play out in 2023. Do you think it's going to be smoke and mirrors and VR will never really come around? Or maybe do you think that the technology is just not there yet, even though that they're coming out with second and third iterations and pro versions of these old VR consoles? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And yeah, man, peace out.
Welcome to the Craig Show. Take two.